A lot of times, when we're living toward blessing, it doesn't feel like blessing at all. It's not easy, it's not comfortable. And sometimes we're willing to trade almost everything about the promise for the security and the safety and the strength and the status of the status quo or the old life, the place that we've come from. We walked in faith, we said yes to God's call, and yet somewhere since then, something's happened. And maybe we know what it is. Maybe we have no idea, but we're stuck. We've settled. Nobody's gonna get yourself up but you. Hey, if you got a Bible, would you grab it and meet me in Genesis 10 today? Genesis chapter 10 is where we're going to start. We're starting a brand new teaching series today that we are really, really excited about. And we're actually going to cover a lot of territory today, but we're not going to go very many pages beyond Genesis 10. So if you got a Bible, you can get open in front of you. It'll help you to read along and not just listen along. Genesis chapter 10 is where we're going to start. And as you're finding Genesis chapter 10, I want to ask you a question. Hopefully you can multitask. Here's the question for you. The question is, what's your sentence? What's your sentence? Claire Booth Luce was one of the first female members of Congress, and she walked into the Oval Office one day and sat down and asked then President John F. Kennedy that question. She said, "Mr. President, what's your sentence?" And he was perhaps as confused as you are, so she went on to explain, "Great leaders," she said, "have lives that are a sentence. What's yours?" What she meant was a leader with a strong purpose and clear direction could be summed up with a single line. So, for example, Abraham Lincoln preserved the nation and freed the slaves. Martin Luther King Jr., he inspired a world to share his dream of racial equality. She was concerned as she looked at John F. Kennedy that he was trying to do too much. He was chasing too many priorities, and as a result, his leadership and his legacy was going to be a complicated paragraph. The end of the day would amount to nothing. So she challenged him to choose his legacy, to anchor his priorities. One single sentence. And I wonder what yours is. Or I wonder what it will be. And maybe even bigger than anything that happens out of the Oval Office, I wonder when heaven defines your story in a sentence, what the sentence will be. What's your sentence? Does that whole idea freak you out a little bit? Maybe especially if you're young, middle school students, high school students, college students. I mean, it's hard enough to choose electives, you know? To choose what college you're going to go to try to pick a major and then decide whether or not to stick with the major, try to decide what you want to do when you get out of college, finally have to decide what you're going to do when you get out of college, to limit your priorities, to draw in some of your potential, and to forecast your life 60, 70, 80 years in a world that's constantly changing, somehow decide what you're going to be then? That feels like a lot of pressure. Or maybe for some of us on the other end of that, some of you that are walking through the sunset years of your life, to think about that question and realize you've already written most of your story. And perhaps from that vantage point to say, I don't know what my sentence would be. Or maybe worse, to say that you do, and you don't like what you're left with. Or maybe you're more like me, smack in the middle of your story. At least you hope. But maybe wondering if you like the sentence you've been writing. And wondering if perhaps it could be better if you changed it from here. Maybe by changing career, or just by getting a sports car, you know? What's your sentence? We started this teaching series today through the life of a guy named Abraham. I want us to look at the sentences of two very different men who lived their lives in two very different directions. One of them knows exactly where he's going, and he gets there. And in the end, his whole world, including him, wishes that he hadn't. And then another guy who, believe it or not, had no idea where he was going and got there. And in the end, the whole world is better because he did. You ready for that? Genesis 10. The first sentence shows up in the flyover country of the Bible. One of those chapters that if you ever do a read through the Bible in a year thing, you just kind of skim over. It's a long list of mostly unpronounceable names, except for an extra sentence about a guy named Nimrod. Genesis chapter 10, look at verse 8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. So just in case that doesn't seem profound to you, maybe a couple of things to point out. First thing, the sentence on Nimrod says he was known for his strength. Verse 8 says he was a mighty warrior. You could translate that word champion. He was a champion. One Hebrew dictionary says it means to be mighty or to have strength, to be great, to be a person at the height of their power. Whatever their power is, that's Nimrod, the person known for strength. And not only that, the sentence goes on to say he was a person who was known for strength. He had strength. He also had status. Do you see that there? It says Nimrod is the guy who was a mighty hunter, which is why it said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter. He was so strong, so mighty, such a champion that his name started to be used as an adjective. Like, that's how you know you've arrived, right? You're king of the mountain when people have to use your name to describe anyone who vaguely resembles you. Like, he's a Schwarzenegger. She's an Einstein. He's a Mother Teresa. They said, he's a Nimrod. Which bounces just a little different these days, doesn't it? That's good, you're paying attention. Don't get ahead of me. This guy was who everybody thought of when they thought of a person with strength. And just like it happens in our day today, when you have personal strength and you combine it with popular status, what happens? People follow you. You become a person of significance. Strength, status, and significance. That's how Genesis 10 goes on. Look at verse 10. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. Now, two places to pay attention to. The first one you've probably heard of. You've heard of Babylon before? Like, you talk about strength, you talk about power and status and significance. It's not going to be too far beyond Genesis chapter 10, where Babylon is the place of strength all over the world. Even still, when we think about some of the major powers in the world, Babylon is one of them. It says Babylon here in Genesis 10 was the beginning of some of Nimrod's strengths. This guy's a pretty big deal, yeah? There's another place that you might not recognize as clearly there that it talks about was part of the place that his kingdoms started. It's a place called Shinar. Flip the page, look down at Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1, where Shinar comes up again. Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 1 says, "Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there." Whose land was Shinar? That's Nimrod territory, right? So this guy is a guy who's a strong guy with status that people followed. In fact, he created a whole movement that reflected him. And as the story moves, you begin to see there in Genesis chapter 11, all of humanity is moving towards Nimrod, not just in location, but in ambition. In fact, look at verse 3, Genesis chapter 11. They, that's the whole world, said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." It's all there, isn't it? Strength, status, significance. That's the sentence that the whole world wants for itself in those days. And you notice the refrain over and over, "Let us make, let us build, so that we may make a name for ourselves." So if you want to just remember one thing, you don't want to remember all three things about them, a sentence of strength and status and significance can be summarized in a couple of words. It's nothing more than selfish ambition. Selfish ambition. And there at the end of verse 4, they peel back the curtain and they tell us where it comes from. You see that? It says, "Otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the earth." You can hear the fear in it, can't you? If we don't grab strength and we don't grab status and significance for ourselves, we're going to be forgotten. We're not going to amount to anything. We're not going to reach our potential. We don't want to be scattered. But if you remember, if you were here for our last series, you do, the call of God gets reflected in Matthew chapter 28. The commission of Jesus, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, was for all of humanity to do what? To scatter, to fill the earth and subdue it, to take the name of God, the reflection of who He is, the image of God, and to take it to the world. It's important to notice their selfish ambition is pulling them away from the purpose of God. And it doesn't go well in their story. They get strength. They get status. They're pretty significant, but that's not why we remember them. We know about them because, do you remember? The whole thing came crashing down. And think about this, because it's a historical story, but it's also a warning for our stories. And especially in a world, come on, that seems desperate to look like Nimrod and to be led by Nimrods everywhere we turn, in our friend groups at school, in our fraternities and sororities, in our businesses, on both sides of the political spectrum. I heard Ben Stewart talk about this one time. He's absolutely right. The world of selfish ambition, strength and status and significance alone, come on, it leads them, do you see it here, in the wrong direction. Like literally the wrong direction. In fact, you see it there in verse 2. It says the people, did you notice, are headed eastward. That's a clue, kind of like an Easter egg in the whole biblical narrative, starting all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. When Adam and Eve fled the garden, they fled paradise from the presence of God. You remember which direction they went? They went east. And from that point on, almost without exception, throughout the biblical narrative, when you see people headed east, it's a clue they're moving away from paradise. They're moving away from the purpose and the person of God. Moving east, walking in the wrong direction. It's not only that, the culture is building on the wrong foundation. Did you see that detail in chapter 11? It's kind of a weird thing to add in there in a narrative of names and societies. It tells about how they built bricks. They built bricks instead of stone. They used tar for mortar. It seems like a weird detail to throw in there. That's a pretty good indication you ought to pay attention to the detail that's thrown in there. You know what a brick is? Just think about what a brick is. A brick is a well-formed fabrication of man's ingenuity. They fit together, but they are far less solid and far less stable than stone. And the writer wants us to see what they're building their foundation on. Man's ingenuity, but it's not as solid and it's not as stable as what God put there himself. The selfish ambition leads to world confusion. Wrong direction, wrong foundation, world confusion. You know the story, God gets involved in the system. And despite their intention and their ambition to make a name for themselves, when their story gets told, how do we know their story? We don't know it as the Tower of Power. What do we know it as? The Tower of Babel. Confusion. You ever spend much time around an 8-month-old? Like, come on, that's one of the hardest times to be a parent, isn't it? They are angry all the time because they're communicating with 100% clarity in their mind. And the only way they know to speak with more clarity is to speak with more intensity. And nobody else understands it. Look, at the end of Nimrod's story, you find a whole culture, a whole society built on strength and status and significance, and it leads to confusion and anger and division. Do I need to draw the parallel, or would that insult your intelligence? Just in case you ever find yourself in a culture like that. Just in case you ever find yourself living in a world that invites you to make strength and status and significance the sentence that you write for a story. High schoolers, middle schoolers, college students, business leaders, voters. Hypothetically, if you ever find yourself in a place like that, you might want to pay attention to at least one example of where stories like that can go. So, hypothetically, what if we did find ourselves in a story like that, in a culture like that, a world like that values sentences like that? A world that feels like it's moving in the wrong direction. A world that feels like it's building on the wrong foundation, starting to show the cracks. A world of confusion and anger and division. People talking with sincerity and intensity, but without any clarity. What would we do? How would we live? What sentence would we write in the middle of a society like that? I'm glad you asked. Even in the middle of a story like that, you don't have to live a sentence like that. There's another genealogy that follows right on the heels of that story, and it begins a totally different legacy, and I want you to see it. It's a legacy of a story of a guy named Abraham. Look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And as we read through this next passage, I want you to help me out as we read it, okay? So there are some portions of this that are underlined up on the screens. As we read it, I'm going to read the part that's not underlined. I want you to read the part that is underlined. We'll go through it together. Can we do it? All right, Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land show you. Make you into a great nation and bless you. Make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. I mean, look, I'm not under any illusion that I am the smartest guy in this room, but I feel like I've got to guess about what maybe might be the emphasis of those verses we just read. Anybody else want to guess? You remember the Nimrod refrain? What was the Nimrod refrain of his story as it gets told? The refrain was, "Let us," over and over and over. What's the refrain here in the story of Abram? I will, God says. God says, I will give you a land, a place for a man who spent most of his life as a wanderer to settle down and call home. God says, I will give you a seed. Life is going to spring out of this 75-year-old life that would live beyond him. And God says, I will bless you and make you a blessing. God says, I'll handle your security. I'll handle your legacy. I'll handle your status. I'll define your significance. And pause just right there for just a second. Don't you long for those things too? Like maybe not in a geopolitical father of the faith kind of way, but a place to come home to, a place to settle down and not wander. Relationships, purpose, a legacy, something that outlives you. Blessing from God that overflows out of your life into the lives of the people that you're around. Like, isn't that what's under the surface of all of us? Isn't that what's under the surface of Nimrod's sentence? Even deeper than the longing for strength and status and significance? It's a longing for the blessing of God. And Abram's going to find it. And he's going to live in it. But he's going to discover it down an unlikely path. Notice, what's Abraham's part in the promise? Well, in some ways, that's a trick question, isn't it? At no point in the promise does God say the words, we will. At no point in the promise does God say the words, if you. This is what theologians call an unconditional covenant. We're going to get into that more in a couple of weeks because God gives us a really clear picture of it. But think for now about it like a gift. Okay, if I give you a gift, but it comes with strings attached to it, at that moment it ceases to be a gift, doesn't it? If you got to do something in order to get it, in order to earn it, it's a wage or perhaps a reward. But at that moment, it ceases to be a gift when I put strings attached to it. If you have to earn it, you can't be confident that I'll give it. And I can't be confident you'll deserve it. So I have to qualify the promise with if you, or you should. God doesn't do that here. This isn't something that Abraham has to earn. This is something he simply receives. But he has to receive it. And you see that in the story. You see there's a response to the giving of the gift. So just think, if I told you today out of the generosity of my heart for you, I have given you a brand new car. I purchased it, I paid for it, no strings attached to it. That it's sitting at the dealership this morning and the only thing you have to do is go there and sign the title and get the keys. And yet you decide it's too far to the dealership. Like it's hot out there today. And you don't go. Is it still true that I've given you a car out of the generosity of my heart? It absolutely is. Your lack of response reflects on you as the receiver, not on me as the giver. It's the same deal here. God says to Abram, Abram, there's a land and a seed and a blessing with your name on it. The only thing is you're not going to find it here with these people as a part of this Nimrod system. It's waiting for you in a land I'll show you. And all Abram does to receive the gift is say yes. And yet notice for Abram, yes took a reset. There's a response, there's also a reset. Remember, Abram lived in the land of let us. The Babel Nimrods were his people. And God says to Abram in chapter 12, verse 1, literally, get yourself out. Get yourself out. Here's what's interesting. At the end of chapter 1, if you go back and read that, the whole family, including Abram's whole family, his dad, his nephew, they all left Ur towards Canaan. In fact, Acts chapter 7 tells us the original call came to Abram in the presence of his dad. They all left for Canaan. They stopped halfway in a place now called Haran. And we don't know why they stopped halfway. But we can imagine, can't we? Why do we stop halfway? Life between the promise and the fulfillment isn't always for the faint of heart. The journey, the quest towards blessing isn't always filled with magical rainbow-puking unicorns and fountains filled with Skittles all along the way. It's often dangerous, discouraging, filled with loss. Abram lost a brother. Lot lost a dad somewhere before the journey even really got started. Terah lost a son. The dad's name, the son's name, the brother's name was Haran, which just so happens to be the name of the place they stopped in the middle. Was that coincidence? Maybe. Did family tragedy, personal grief catch up with them and stop them in their tracks in a place they named Haran to remember? Maybe. We don't know. A lot of times, when we're living toward blessing, it doesn't feel like blessing at all. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. And sometimes we're willing to trade almost everything about the promise for the security and the safety and the strength and the status of the status quo or the old life, the place that we've come from, however bad it was, whatever it lacked, and whatever's promised. And we stop halfway to the promise. I wonder if you've stopped halfway to the promise this morning. I bet that's the story of some of us, especially some of us that are midway through our lives. Some of us that are later on in the story. As we look back and realize where we've traveled and where we've been and where we've yet to go, I bet it's true of some of us that are younger. Middle schoolers and high schoolers and college students. We started strong. We walked in faith. We said yes to God's call. And yet somewhere since then, something's happened. And maybe we know what it is. Maybe we have no idea. But we're stuck. We've settled halfway between faith and faithfulness. Nobody's gonna get yourself up but you. And right where you're stuck, right where you're at, just like Abraham, even 75 years into his story, God's saying, come on, there's story still to live. For Abraham, it takes a reset towards God's promise instead of the promise of Nimrod, Babel that he'd marinated in his whole life. And so he says yes, and he goes. And he goes, and he goes. And then check this out, chapter 12, verse 6. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord, who'd appeared to him. From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So you see something there that's absolutely critical to Abram's sentence, even though he's going to struggle to live it for the rest of his story. Notice it says that he pitched a tent and he built an altar. If you're taking notes and you want a third R there, write the word release. Release. Look, the whole point of a tent is that it's movable, right? You could pick it up and take it with you wherever you go. Even for a guy who's promised a land, Abram is pretty clearly saying here, I want to put myself in position to go wherever you send me as soon as you say. He's living in such a way that the first yes to respond to the promise becomes his posture for everyday living from there. He's releasing control of his position so that he can continue to say yes to wherever God calls. He pitches a tent. J.D. Greer says he puts his yes on the table and let God put it on the map. And it's not that he didn't have good access to strong building materials for something more permanent. He did, because that same passage that tells us he pitched a tent for himself also tells us that he built an altar. And just for a second, think about what an altar is. Think about what it represents. An altar is this. An altar is a permanent structure built from hard, broken things put together in a way that point towards God's faithfulness. An altar is a permanent structure built from hard, broken things put together in a way that point towards God's faithfulness. And pay attention to that, because in a lot of ways, that's going to be the story of Abraham's life. Sometimes through his faithfulness, but generally through his brokenness. The altar represents his story. And it represents yours. The altar is also a place of release, of sacrifice, of submission. Abram builds a permanent structure on which he lays his past and his potential towards a promise that he has not yet seen in full. The permanent altar is a place of ambition, submission. Abraham doesn't lose his ambition. We're going to see that all throughout the rest of the story. But at least here, at least for now, he submits it. And from there, his story begins. And that's where your story can begin too, wherever you are in your story. Abraham's sentence, you don't have to turn there. Let me show it to you. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4 says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, check this out, even though he did not know where he was going. I love that last part, because it takes the pressure off for us, doesn't it? Look, at no point do you have to have your whole life defined. You simply have to have your devotion aligned. And if that doesn't rhyme enough for you, here's the big point. Aim your ambition in the direction of devotion. Let God define the destination. Aim your ambition in the direction of devotion and let God define the destination. Abraham does not know where he's going, but he's determined who he's going to follow there. When that person moves, he's positioned himself to be ready and to keep saying yes. What about you? Now, in some ways, it'd be easy to stop right there and walk away with enough for the week, right? But if we did, you might be tempted to walk away with what my friend John calls a do-gooder message. Instead of living your life for strength and status and significance, add a little splash of religious do-better, you'll feel better. That's not the end of the story. The promise to Abraham is part of a bigger promise. To send one who would not just make us different from the Nimrods around us, but who will set us free from the Nimrod within us. Who is faithful to the invitation of the Father, to leave the glories of heaven, to put on flesh and pitch his tent among us, to secure our blessing in his dying and rising to life, to offer and secure eternal strength and status and significance, not just for this life, but for the next, and to offer it to us as a gift with no strings attached, simply the invitation to say yes. If you look at Abram's story, and you say, I could never live like that, you totally miss the point of his story, which is that someone already has and is willing to do it in you and with you and through you. And if you've never said yes to him, today's your day. I'm going to give you a chance to do that in just a moment. For the rest of us, I wonder what the sentence of your life will be. Here's what I know. Whatever it looks like, however it looks today from where you are, if the substance of your sentence is something that begins and ends with strength and status and significance, you are going to live your life and ultimately give your life for something far too small. And Abram's going to wrestle with this over and over and over through his story, and you will too, and that's good news. He didn't know. He couldn't know what hung in the balance for every decision that he made, and you won't either. That's part of why his story is here, to remind us and inspire us to open our hands and live our lives one yes at a time on the ultimate promise of the one who is faithful, that we'll see blessing that we never dreamed and be a blessing in ways we never dreamed when the promise of God comes to life, even if we don't yet know where we're going. Would you bow your head with me? If this morning you're here, you've never put your trust in the work of Jesus on your behalf, the best news you can hear, the best thing that I can tell you today, God sent his one and only Son to the earth to live a perfect life, to die the death that you deserve to die, and to rise from life to offer you a promise, his presence with you wherever you go, his forgiveness from your past, and his power for all of your future, and he gives it to you as a gift with no strings attached. You simply have to say yes. And so right this moment, right where you're at in the privacy of your heart, if you're ready to say yes to that promise, you can tell him that right this moment. It's as simple as saying, Lord, I realize that I have fallen so far short of your design for me, but I believe Jesus didn't, and that he died to pay the penalty that I owe you, and he rose from the dead to give me forgiveness and his presence and his life forever. And today I'm saying yes. Lord, for those who are receiving that gift for the very first time, for some of us who are coming back and remembering the gift that you've given to us, would you let us be people who position our lives to say yes with every step? To be people who, even when we don't have a clearly defined sentence, have a person that we've decided to put our trust in. Would you let us say yes to you for the next step that you guide us to, and the next one after that, and the next one after that? And Lord, would you give us the ability to settle down in your presence, the ability to live a life that lives beyond us. And ultimately, Lord, would you remind us of our significance in the sight of God Almighty, and let us live like that's true and extend blessing wherever we go. We ask it in Jesus' name for his sake. Amen.
Hey, thanks for watching. If something you heard resonated with you today, we would love to connect with you. Visit doxology.church/connect or leave a comment below. And if you enjoyed today's message and you want to see more, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos.